What makes a strong brand position? Today we're going to dissect brand positioning. Ye who positions wins, right? So let's start with the 101s. What is positioning? MC, good morning.
Morning, Dave. Yeah, I mean, I think the easy place to start is it's in the name. So positioning is all about occupying a position. And when we talk about that in branding, we're really talking about the position that you're looking to occupy in your audience's mind. So, as we've talked about last week in strategy, branding is about, what you want people to think and feel when they think about your brand. And so positioning is getting that down on paper and actually outlining, that patch of grass that you're going to own. So it's about who you are, who you serve, how you're different, why you care, and ultimately why someone else should care too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. That's a good start. So what makes a good positioning? Like, can you distill positioning down into even a formula of some sort?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some facets that we always look at. In terms of it being good, I think it's often just about it being clear. As a first point of call. Is it actually articulating well, what you're all about and those sorts of things. Definitely authentic is another one. We rattle on about that a lot. Authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
Is it coming from a real and true place? And is it unique? I mean, that's a lot of what positioning is about. Even just how do you positioning yourself against competitors, or in a general market sense, where do you sit that's different or unique to everybody else?
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of a formula itself, like there's 4 components, I guess, that we always look at, and you want to keep it simple, and that's part of why I guess this framework exists. It's not something that we've invented per se, but it's pretty tried and true. And it starts firstly with who you're for. What's that audience that you're looking to serve. Then moves on to what you do. So this isn't really just about a boring list of services. It's actually, what's the problem that you solve, and that should be a large part of why you exist in the first place. Then moves on to the third thing, which is how do you do it? So what makes you unique in terms of how you're delivering that product or service? Is there anything else particularly stand out about your business and how you do what you do? And the final thing then is the reasons to believe. So why should anyone actually believe those things that you're saying? What is it that you've got in your arsenal to back that up and prove that, you really believe and can deliver on what you're saying? So that kind of makes up the 4 things that we set out to define when we define a new brand position. And I know you've got a bit of a different take on the same sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it runs a similar kind of line, but it's slightly differently. I mean, the way that I look at it is almost in a very formulaic way: mission plus differentiated approach plus core customer plus deep expertise equals positioning. So that is, again, mission, differentiated approach, core customer plus deep expertise equals position.
You know a lot of maths, Dave.
Yeah.
You've done the power of 10 in there or something. But yeah. I like it.
Yeah.
Okay. So break it down a bit for me. What goes into each one of those steps?
Yeah. So with, I guess, mission could come back to your why, but also when most businesses start, or they tend to arrive at a point where they've figured out what their mission is, and the clearer that mission is, the clearer you can articulate that to your customer base. Differentiated approach, I think the more ways you can be different, not for the sake of being different, but I think the more that you can differentiate your approach, the more likely you are to stand out against your competitors.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we've always tried to do with our own brands that we've had over the years.
Yeah, for sure. And core customer, and we can talk a bit more about core customer, but deep expertise, I think, is the other aspect of this too, is like, rather than being super wide, I think, especially in today's competitive marketplace, you've got to be deep on that expertise base.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's tease apart that formula a little bit, and let's start with that core customer element. So just give us a bit of an insight into why I think customers need to be at the center of your formula.
Yeah, well, I think mission and differentiation is important, and that's a critical part of the formula. But without the core customer piece really being considered, the whole formula falls apart, the positioning falls apart. So I think what we're looking for with core customers is super users.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want to be too wide. We want to actually tailor the experience and the positioning around that super user, because that creates more solid positioning. So that's why I always put core customer really at the core of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a great place to start. You know, it's like, I think another way of saying what you're on about there is that, like, it's great to have a mission that's important to you, but if it's not important to your customers, then, you know, it's not going to resonate.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Cool. All right. So, I mean, something that we talk about a bit, and maybe we have differing opinions on, is whether you should be niched in positioning.
Yeah.
But by niched being kind of deep on something. So I guess the question is, you know, should we be niched? I mean, if you look at, say, for example, Amazon, they sell books and servers. They sell Alexa and automated grocery stores. They're definitely not niched in any way.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, do we need to be niched, or is that just a modern day business fallacy?
Yeah. Look, I think, I mean, firstly, you got to ask, like, what's the benefit of niching in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
I think it definitely helps in a lot of ways if you can narrow the focus, and certainly the antidote of being everything for everyone, you know, is usually a ticket to failure. I mean, even with the Amazon example, I'm sure there's undercurrents of why they've ended up in those different business areas, and they're still not trying to be everything to everyone. You know, if you are doing that, then you'll find that you end up with a pretty weak positioning that no one gives a shit about. So it definitely makes your position clearer and allows you to focus on the needs of a smaller group of people. But I guess the thing is that, for me, it often gets sort of overused or overdone or overemphasized, you know, so it's seen as something strict that you have to do, and the more niche you get, I guess, the better. And I think really for me, it's just about finding a bit more of a balance, you know, especially when you're early in your business and you're probably still learning a little bit about who you really serve and how best to solve their problems. I just think you just don't want to go too niche just because, you know, it sort of ticks the business textbook box, I should say.
Yep.
But I know it's something that you're pretty passionate about, and nichier the better. So what do you think about it all?
Well, I mean, I think if you've got billions of dollars in reserve, and so you have the cash flow and the capital to support being broader, then probably niching could be argued as a fallacy. But I guess I would even argue that many of those businesses who have very deep cash reserves, who have the ability to be across many different business units, often create really subpar products as a result, but just because they just don't have that deep expertise.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, like if you take, for example, somebody like Beats, who essentially position themselves in sound, right? Mm-hmm. So they, you know, specifically headphones, I mean, they entered into a pretty crowded space, right? Like, did we really need another headphone brand at the time when Beats arrived? Probably not. But they managed to make a dent in that space because that's all they did at that time when they launched into the market, was just headphones. Had they been headphones and home entertainment and TVs and other hi-fi equipment, it probably wouldn't have worked out as well for them. But because they were specific and they were niched and well-resourced, that helps.
Yeah.
They were able to really, you know, gain some market share, which is I think goes towards why niching in positioning it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you took let's take another local example, like in insurance, for example. Let's say you were starting an insurance company today, which God help you.
Yeah.
But I mean, you wouldn't pick a general insurance firm. Like, you wouldn't. That would be suicidal. Like, to go just general insurance. I think what you'd have to do is pick a vertical, like go after a particular type of insurance, maybe build some tech aimed at a very specific, you know, type of customer to me, that's actually a smarter way to position.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially when you don't have investors or you don't have deep pockets. Positioning becomes even more critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to even use your Beats example is a good one in the sense of what I was on about, which is they've niched in terms of their product offering, and they're sort of niched, I'd say, a little bit in their target customer, but they didn't go, I guess, too hyper specific on every front, to still be broad enough. Because I guess the thing for me at the end of the day is the niching part, like everything else here, has to mean something. Like, is it a niche that not just exists in terms of demographics, but a niche that identifies and cares about, the way that you're identifying and trying to communicate to them.
I mean, and that's the thing, I guess, is like, with niching, I think niching is almost like a de-risking strategy, but it's often looked at it the other way around. It's like, oh my god, we're only going after one specific super user, but what about all these other customers that are out there?
There's a lot of FOMO.
Yeah, there's a lot of FOMO that goes in around niching. So I don't know. I think though it's probably the opposite. It's actually de-risking, your entry into any particular market or vertical. So that's why I'm still in favour of niching.
Me too. Just maybe not as much. Yeah, I mean, look, for me, it's about finding the right problem to solve first. So we've talked a bit about having the customer at the centre of what you're doing, and I sort of see that problem that you're trying to solve as overlapping a lot with that. So I think a lot of brands, they just start out with a list of services, or they've come up with a new product idea that they think is great. And you were sort of talking about this before with your super user theory, is like, but have they actually really gone out there and understood the market and understood their customer, and what's the job that they really want solved or done for them? Because at the end of the day, that's every service or product is just doing a job for your customer. So
I mean, do you see brands that just launch too quickly into a market or a vertical where they haven't really figured out what the problem is?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because I think too, that's when you end up with a lot of same kind of businesses, or they're doing something that someone else has already done before, or they're just kind of maybe trotting out the same old thing but trying to put a glossy veneer on it, as opposed to trying to find some new kind of insight or nugget of truth that really matters to their customers. And often this is where it's like, it's not immediately an obvious thing, like most of the more interesting and ultimately successful businesses often come out of something that wasn't thought of before, or the customer probably couldn't articulate that that's what they wanted. That's sort of a famous Steve Jobsism as well. It's like, don't ask the customer what they want because they can't tell you, and you don't misinterpret that and say, well, don't ask them at all. It's more just about understanding them and then trying to find a bit of a unique slant or insight.
Yeah, I mean, because it is a bit of a nuanced territory what you're talking about there, though, right? Because you do like, yes, if you took that Steve Jobs maxim of like, okay, the customer doesn't really know what they're going to want in 12 months' time. That's your job as a business to figure out how to serve them better in the future. But then also at the same time, you want to be able to somehow like ratify that and try and figure that piece out. And that can be really nuanced and a bit tricky. Yeah. I mean, it does also. Is it a lack of originality or creativity or just a want to make money that you have brands where they just want to enter into a vertical because they think that there's money to be made there, rather than actually having like a proper like mission?
Yeah, I mean, I think that often is the case, and particularly if you're talking about a new brand starting out, a lot of people do approach it just, well, I think I'm going to make a bunch of money here, as opposed to something that they care about. They think that they've seized onto an opportunity, or but it can equally go the other way too, where it's just, this is what they've known, or this is where they come from, so they're just sort of maybe trying to trot it out again. And I think they probably look to other ways and means to differentiate, other than actually finding a different way to solve either the same problem in a new way, or find a new problem or a new slant on a problem and solve it. But we certainly see that that's where you come up with, I guess, a much more interesting position, because you're sort of solving a unique challenge. A good example is, we've had a client who spun out of an accounting firm, and they realized that over the years what their customers really wanted wasn't just someone to do their tax return, but they wanted a trusted advisor, someone that they could talk to through any business challenge, and so they've actually carved out a unique position and quite a successful business by morphing their role and sort of solving, what they identified as a unique challenge in a different way.
Yeah, it's a good example.
Cool. So once you've found that right problem to solve, then how do you differentiate?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good question, because, differentiation, I think the more degrees of differentiation you can build into your business model, the more chance that you've got of succeeding, of winning. So, for example, if I was a law firm starting out today, I wouldn't do it in a traditional, go and set up some offices and go and do networking events and do the typical fee for service model. I'd be thinking about it differently in every aspect. So breaking down the business model into how it's done traditionally, and then thinking about each one of those things. And you could probably break apart a law firm into maybe 10 major pieces, mm-hmm. right? And then just looking at each of those major pieces and going, well, how can we do this different? How can we do it better? Yeah. And it's interesting when you do that exercise, when you break it down and then you start to look at each of the different components and how you might do it better, that you end up, even if you only change 3 or 4 of those 10 major components, mm-hmm. you're going to be differentiated enough that you're going to attract attention.
Yeah. So how do you figure out, though, like, which ones to choose and how to be different? Because, as you said before, like, you don't want to be different just for the sake of it. A different position alone doesn't help you win, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you've got to start from a place of theory. Like, we think that this might be the right way to do it, but then, like we were talking about earlier, I think you've got to have the ability to ratify that somehow. Yeah. So that might just be pulling in, if you're already in the industry, maybe pulling in 10 of your best customers mm-hmm. and asking a bunch of questions, showing them a prototype. Yeah. I think it's actually that research piece that we don't often do as business owners and founders, because I think sometimes we're actually scared about the answers. Like, we're scared if the answers don't come back in our favor, we're like, well, man, I'm back at square one again. Yeah. So it's crazy though, because it's actually fast and it's a cheap way of doing it is doing some user testing and research. So yeah.
Cool.
All right. So I mean, sometimes we talk about we often talk about great positioning, mm-hmm. but sometimes positioning doesn't go so well.
Yeah. Positioning
fails. So let's talk about where it can go pear-shaped.
Yeah.
Because there are some pitfalls.
For sure. And I think, in a lot of ways it's sort of just the other side of the coin of a few things that we've already talked about. The number one for me is when you start out and you don't have a strong why or a bigger vision that you're striving for. Like, basically you're just doing a business for the sake of it, or you do think that there's just a quick way to make money. Mm-hmm. And if there's nothing inspiring and passionate about it for you, then that's just going to trickle down and not just into your brand positioning, but into your company culture and how you sort of see and treat your staff and how they then in turn treat your customers. And I think that then just follows on then to how your story comes across, and you end up not really believing in what you say. So again, if you've just seen an opportunity and you're trying to capitalize on that, you'll come across as not very authentic, and customers will see through that pretty quickly.
Yep.
Another one is that you might not have anything that's really unique about your business, so that process you've talked about there, you haven't really broken it down and thought about, where you can be different, how you can deliver those services differently, or, even starting from a more original place in terms of what problem you're trying to solve. So I think it's really just, it's thinking those things through and understanding that, you've got to have some sort of patch of ground that you're trying to own and why you care about it. and then the rest of it will take care of itself. But
yeah,
is there anything else that you see?
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, and I think this is the point of positioning, is that, and why it's important to do it like as early as you possibly can, and if you don't understand or don't grasp positioning early on in the piece, it can come back to bite you in the backside, because if you have to shift positions multiple times, let's say over the first 5 years of your business life, if you have to reposition 4 or 5 times, or maybe even just 2 or 3 times, each time you do that, you tend to lose some customers. You might gain some, but more often than not, those core customers who first started with you get a bit confused about what your business is about, and I think that's where it can get really messy. So
how do you line that up though with the idea of pivoting? I mean, that's a pretty fashionable and sexy thing to talk about these days.
I mean pivoting is look, if things aren't working out, as in you're just not getting the customers that you're chasing, or the business model doesn't work, then should you keep doing the same thing and expect different results? No, that would be insane to do that. But I think to pivot means that the model's not working well. So you need to be very deliberate about a pivot and choose the right timing. But I mean, for me, pivoting is like sort of like that break in emergency situation, break in case of emergency.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is with pivoting is, a good pivot comes out of some new insight or something that you've uncovered through the rest of it. So it's even less about, oh shit, everything's not working, so I better do something else.
Yeah.
It's more, well, I started out with these few things and I thought this part of it was going to be the big part of the business, but no, it's actually this part, and so let's focus more in that area. So that's how I see.
Yeah, and let's not also forget that, I mean, business does change and morph over time, and we are always making these micro little changes to our businesses as we go, and bolting something new onto your business can enhance it, as long as the core of your business model is not completely overhauled.
I think definitely consistency is a huge thing. If you're changing it all the time, it's going to fall over pretty quick. And I think that point also goes back to what we were talking about last week with strategy. You think that the underlying parts of it, the why, the core values and all those sorts of things that you really believe in, the mission from your formula as well, like those parts should endure, and you can sort of move around the execution of how you might deliver or go after that. But you definitely want that consistency, and that should hopefully shine through. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I mean, we've looked at a few different facets of the formula, but just to recap, it's who you are for, understanding that customer, what are the problems and challenges that they're facing, and then leading that into what you do and how you can solve for that. And thinking about how you deliver that service, and that's where that differentiation and unique aspect comes into it. And then ultimately, making it believable and authentic, and giving customers those reasons to buy into your story. So that kind of sums up positioning. But, is there any trends or things that you're seeing in the market that are changing to do with positioning? Yeah,
I mean, I guess you do tend to see little trends that occur in positioning. I mean, the first one that I've noticed, and we can thank Seth Godin for this one, which that book Tribes, that he wrote a long time ago, and he obviously writes a lot on tribes or 1,000 True Fans. That really hyper-focused positioning, niches that you wouldn't even think are niches, like that. But you only need 1,000 people to like tap into that, and
so that's why you like niching so much,
and resonate,
because Seth told you to.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because it's like because a lot of these things you quite often think, oh well, those ideas aren't going to scale. Yeah. But oftentimes, when you really kind of get into what it is that super user really wants, you find that there are more than actually 1,000 true fans out there. Yeah. So, but I also think in like just being hyper competitive world that we currently are in at the moment, where it's so easy to spin up a business, you do want to be really like laser focused. Yeah, for sure. And so I definitely see that as a trend. Social awareness, I think, from a positioning standpoint, I think is a big one. And I think as we sort of move post money, what I mean by that is it's not just about the profitability of a company. I think we're talking about employee health. I think we're talking about general well-being. We're talking about impacts to the society, and not just being money-making machines. I see that as a positioning trend going forward. So social awareness. And the last one is environmental. I mean, environmental has been around for a while now, but I think that it's almost like environmental 2.0 now, that we're actually realizing that climate change and the impacts to our planet and the way that we do business, we have a responsibility as companies to do something about that, and play our part. So I think the environmental part of do less, harm, do no harm in your supply chain is definitely going to be a trend, and it's going to continue.
And are you seeing any great brands or businesses in those last categories of social responsibility?
Look, the one that always comes to mind is Patagonia. I used them as an example last time, but I mean they've done such a great job in both those, social awareness and environmental awareness.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to a conversation the other day about ethics in business and how that a lot of brands start out with those things as core tenets.
Yeah.
But why does it fail so often? And I guess the upshot of it was that once a company goes public, it's actually then, the shareholders' interests become primary, and short-term profits end up winning out over that long-term view. It was interesting, they used Patagonia as an example and saying that the reason that they're actually able to stick to it is because the same guy owns 100% of the shares. And he said he won't sell a single share because as soon as that happens, he thinks that it'll start to erode into that mission.
So if you want to have a great company that's socially aware and environmentally aware, don't go on the ASX.
Well, I mean, some of the other things they talked about was actually ingraining it into your company charter, before you even, went public or sold shares.
Right.
There's other things like B corporations where you become certified and sort of make it more part of your business. And I guess, I mean, what you'd hope there, like as a through line for everything that we've been saying, is if that's part of your why and your mission from the start, then it should endure. But I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, again, like positioning in public companies and even in shareholders, when you think about shareholders, it makes a lot of sense, because shareholders are customers at the end of the day too.
Yeah.
So they could very well be your customer, but also your shareholder.
For sure. And that's what we talked about last week when we talked about audiences, and understanding them as opposed to your customers. Shareholders is a great example of an audience of a brand, that you have to sort of factor into these decisions.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, from a trend standpoint, I mean, do you see any that are happening at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the one that's interesting to me is you're seeing a lot more businesses where the product is the brand, and what I mean by that is like, if you think about more traditional industries like services or retail or whatever, there's all this layers that exist, around the product itself, in terms of either service or environment, or, there's a lot more, I guess, touch points that aren't just the service itself. Whereas, when you're seeing things like software as a service businesses, social media, dating apps, whatever, anything that's like a purely digital product, 90% or more, sometimes it's just 100% of your experience with that brand is the product, so it's just you tapping on it, using it, you're not talking to anyone about it, you're literally just having that experience. And so that in and of itself like creates some interesting challenges, I think, for positioning, because, how do you communicate a message? How do you have a personality? How do you make sure that user experience is aligning with your brand? And
yeah, I mean that can be tough, right? Because when you are like a purely digital company, it's like, how do you get that human element across?
Yeah. So they're having to position themselves through the product, and
right.
how it works. So that's where something like user experience, which isn't something you typically think of as being so aligned to brand, just comes straight to the fore. But even like onboarding, what's the first thing that happens when you use the product, and those sorts of things that will guide them through and help them understand what your position is as a brand.
Yeah, I mean, my strategy mind immediately goes to, like, if I was running a company like that, it's like, how do we make this company as human as we possibly can, even though we're not going to be interacting from human to human?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's definitely something to consider. I mean, and then is there any way that I guess you can add more human experience to that? How do you move beyond the digital into the physical? I mean, they had the Big Zero conference last week, up our way, and I think that's a good example of a digital brand where most people know of Xero, the accounting software, and their whole experience would literally just be through the interface. But they built this, very exciting and interactive kind of conference event series around their brand, to bring it out of the screen and into the real world.
Yeah, that's a good one to bring up, because it does allow, I guess, customers, specifically accountants, to meet with the people behind the platform and know that there are actually real people there.
What are you saying about accountants? They can't meet people in the real world?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
We love accountants.
Yeah, we do.
Beautiful.
Cool. All right. Awesome. Well, I mean, look, there's actually a lot to unpack around positioning. So I think it's been a good chat to sort of dive into it and work our way around it. I mean, it just brings to mind for me that positioning is just so vital in the way that we shape up brands. It really is one of those foundational layers that I could spend all morning talking about. But
sure.
I think that's a good place to leave it.
Absolutely.
Thanks, MC.
Cheers, mate.
Okay, cheers.